When Audrey Mabry was wooed by New York City police detective Chris Haney, she couldn't believe her luck.
I remember him smiling at me, and I just thought to myself, this is the guy I'm gonna marry.
But before the honeymoon was over, Audrey would see an evil ignited within him.
You don't normally see police officers involved in these types of crimes.
And her once loving husband would turn against her in an explosion of hate.
I remember falling down to my knees. What did he do to her?
He was enraged beyond anything I've ever seen in my life. And I'm thinking, there's no way I'm gonna get out of here.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. At 20 years old, Audrey Mabry was ready to start a new life for herself.
I had been born and raised in the same town my whole life. I had just come out of a relationship, so I wanted to move out of my hometown and kind of start over.
In April of 2003, the small-town waitress moved from Fort Hood, Texas, to the city of El Paso. A couple weeks later, Audrey found herself home with nothing to do.
I was off from work one day, bored out of my mind, and got onto the computer and just got into a random chat room. I noticed a screen name that popped out to me that was black and bold for you. I had always been attracted to black men, so I clicked on the name.
And Audrey was pleased to discover that the man behind the eye-catching handle was equally interesting. His name was Chris Haney, a New York City police detective and single father of 2.
He said he had been previously engaged and he had 2 children from that relationship.
Chris also told Audrey he was 35 years old, 15 years her senior. But Audrey didn't mind.
I thought to myself, this is the guy that knows where he's going in life and is on the right track.
I think what drew Audrey to Chris was that he was different from her other relationships. This was a stable man with a stable job.
Before long, Chris and Audrey were talking non-stop on the phone. And a few months later, Chris invited Audrey to the Big Apple so they could meet in person.
This was absolutely a crazy idea, but the fact that he was the cop made me feel like I could trust him.
On June 9th, 2003, when Audrey first laid eyes on Chris, she was instantly captivated.
His smile was humongous, the biggest smile I had ever seen in my entire life, and I was immediately drawn to it. He puts his arms around me, and I'd never felt so safe. And I just thought to myself, this is the guy I'm gonna marry.
In October of 2003, Audrey moved to New York to be with her new love. But shortly after Audrey moved in with Chris, he came to her with a confession.
He expressed to me that he was not 35, he was actually 38. I had some concerns about that, but thought to myself, it was kind of silly. It was only 3 years. He wanted to appeal to a younger girl, and that's why he did it.
Audrey let the matter go. There were more exciting things to think about. Her relationship with Chris was flourishing, and she soon met his ex-fiancé and their 2 children. Chris was still on good terms with them, and all 3 accepted Audrey instantly.
It made me feel amazing that they were so welcoming to me, and it gave me hope for our future.
In the fall of 2004, after 1 year of dating, Chris proposed, and Audrey gladly accepted. Just a few months later, the happy couple discovered Audrey was pregnant.
I didn't really want to raise my children in New York City, and I told him I always wanted to live in Florida, so we sort of formulated this plan.
Chris purchased a lovely home for his new family in Apollo Beach, Florida. And in April 2005, Audrey moved in while Chris stayed behind in New York to finish his last year with the police force. On September 10th, 2005, Chris and Audrey welcomed their son into the world.
The long distance was difficult, but Chris would come every 5 weeks to visit, so we would still see each other pretty frequently.
It seemed nothing, not even distance, could stop the couple. Until 4 years later, when Audrey discovered the man she loved was hiding an unimaginable evil. Audrey's nightmare began the afternoon of November 17th, 2009. She had just finished a run and stopped by the house to freshen up.
Chris was not supposed to be home that day.
But Chris was home. And when Audrey opened the front door, she stopped dead in her tracks at the horrifying sight that greeted her.
As soon as I entered, there he was with a butcher knife in his hand and charges at me.
Audrey was terrified, but she had no idea that this was just the beginning.
If he wasn't gonna have her, no one was gonna have her.
I see blood dropping to the floor. And in my mind, I'm like, what the hell is going on right now?
In the spring of 2006, 3 years before Audrey Mabry found Chris Haney waiting for her with a butcher knife, the young mother was living in Florida, anticipating the arrival of her fiancé.
Chris had to stay in New York because he was still, a cop. He had 1 year left until he was going to retire. It was pretty lonely, but we had experienced it before in the very beginning, so we were kind of good at it in a sense.
Despite the distance between them, Chris and Audrey were making it work. But just a few weeks later, while Chris was still in New York, his brother and sister-in-law came to Florida for a visit, and they unwittingly delivered some distressing news.
And it was at a dinner where his sister-in-law asked me if Chris and his wife were divorced yet.
Audrey was confused. Chris had called the mother of his 2 children his ex-fiancée.
I felt betrayed. I felt like I had been living a lie the entire time. I confronted him about it very quickly, and he admitted that not only had he been married, but he was in fact still married.
But Chris insisted that the marriage was in name only, and it was simply to keep their children on his health insurance.
Every part of me was screaming to leave, but I stayed because we hadn't even had an opportunity to be a family yet.
A few months later, Chris finally retired from the police department and joined Audrey and their infant son in Florida.
When Chris came down to Florida, he promised he would get divorced. My hopes from that point on was to make it work.
And over the next few years, that's exactly what the couple did. Chris got a security job, and Audrey juggled plans to go back to school while working part-time at a restaurant.
I started babysitting for Audrey shortly after Malachi was born. They were the best parents. Chris seemed like a loving father who would do anything for his child.
And in the spring of 2008, Chris kept his promise. He finalized his divorce, and Audrey realized she was pregnant again. The happy couple decided it was finally time to tie the knot. Audrey and Chris exchanged vows in the summer of 2008, on the same day they had met 5 years earlier.
I was emotional in the midst of it. I felt like I was fulfilling this dream that I had since I was a child.
6 months after the wedding, Audrey gave birth to another bouncing baby boy. The newlyweds were so proud of their growing family. But Audrey's hopes for a lasting marriage would suddenly come crashing down less than 2 years later. In the fall of 2009, just as Audrey started going back to school, Chris came to her with a disturbing confession that destroyed everything she had tried to build.
He said, listen, there's something that I've been hiding from you. I've been gambling. I always knew that Chris enjoys to gamble, and that was always fine with me, as long as he paid every bill that we had.
But Audrey had no idea how much Chris's habit had been costing them.
He had gambled 2 months of the bills away. And I asked him, well, what do you mean? And he said, I mean everything. I haven't paid it in 2 months. So I was angry.
Exhausted by the thought of having to dig out her family financially and disgusted by Chris's irresponsible behavior, Audrey knew she had to get out of the marriage.
It was constantly lies. I felt like you're 40-something years old and you still don't have your priorities straight. So I decided that I was done for good. The first thing out of my mouth was, I want a divorce. And he was not happy with that, but my mind was made up.
Even though Audrey was determined to move on with her life, keeping the peace for the kids was important. And Audrey was pleasantly surprised when Chris seemed to be handling things like an adult.
I expressed to him that I would be moving out December 1st of that year. We worked opposite shifts, so I didn't really have to see him a lot. So things were civil.
But what happened next made Audrey think twice. just a few weeks later, Chris picked Audrey up from work, and right away, she knew something was very wrong.
He met me at the bar right next door from my job and came in, had a beer, had a shot, and he wasn't a heavy drinker either. On the car ride home, he began telling me how I was his wife and I still had wifely duties that I needed to fulfill. I thought he was joking.
But once they arrived home, Audrey quickly realized Chris was dead serious.
I went into the bedroom and, like, out of nowhere, I find myself up against the wall and then thrown on the bed. Before I know it, he's trying to unbutton my pants, puts his hand over my mouth and says, "Shut the F up." I was just freaking out. And by the grace of God, I miraculously swept from under him and escaped and ran to my stepson's door and started banging on the door because I knew he would not do anything like that in front of his son. And that's exactly what happened. He stopped instantly.
Shaken, Audrey filed a domestic abuse report against Chris.
I was utterly shocked that he was capable of something so disgusting and violating.
Audrey wanted nothing more than to shut the book on her life with Chris Haney. But Chris wasn't about to let her go that easily.
Chris seemed extremely desperate to get her back at whatever cost.
My neighbor runs to me, she's just screaming.
He had become a monster.
By November of 2009, Audrey Mabry feared her estranged husband, Chris Haney, had become dangerous.
Audrey called me and Chris tried to RAPE me, just like that. I was actually shocked. This is Chris. He loves her. He would never hurt her.
After speaking to the police, I left and went to a friend of mine's and stayed there for 4 days until I could get my own apartment.
Audrey was frightened, but she knew communication with Chris was inevitable.
I felt like I had to talk to him because he had birth certificates and social security cards, and I couldn't sign my lease without those documents.
When Audrey finally made contact a week later, Chris seemed like a different man. He was incredibly contrite and begged for forgiveness.
He continuously expressed that he was very sorry for whatever happened, but that he could not remember what happened. My excuse for him was he drank that night. So I thought maybe that was what caused it.
Chris told Audrey that if she didn't press charges, he would pay child support and he would help her with the monthly bills.
Chris made it very clear to me that if he was to face these charges, that he was absolutely going to lose his job.
Audrey struggled with the decision, but ultimately agreed to Chris's terms and dropped the charges.
I wanted to believe the good in him. I wanted to believe that what he did was fueled by the alcohol.
As the two amicably began coordinating their schedules to take care of the children, Audrey couldn't help but feel she'd made the right choice.
We began taking care of the children as a team, where if we didn't want to wake up the kids in the middle of the night when I came home from work, then I would sleep at his house. And this continued for a couple of weeks.
Audrey felt relieved that the worst seemed to be behind her. She could never have known that her nightmare was just beginning. On November 17th, 2009, Audrey stopped by Chris's house after a jog. She simply wanted to wash up before work. But when Audrey opened the front door, Chris was waiting, and the sight was terrifying.
There he was, with a butcher knife in his hand, and charges at me. I remember turning for the door to open it and him shutting the door with his hand as he's got me scooped up from behind. And the knife caught me on my finger. So I look down to the floor and I see blood dropping to the floor. And in my mind, I'm like, this is very real.
Audrey desperately tried to make sense of the situation, while Chris dragged her into the garage, where he had a blanket laid out on the floor.
And he puts the knife to my throat, and he's trying to rape me from behind. And I'm saying to him, what are you doing? I love you, saying anything to make him stop.
But Chris only responded with more violence, hitting Audrey over the head with a hammer several times.
I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm gonna die right now. He was enraged beyond anything I've ever seen in my life. The image of my children comes to my mind, of them growing up alone. And I start praying, God, just let me live, that's all I want.
Audrey knew she was in a fight for her life, especially when Chris suddenly doused her with gasoline.
He looks at me, very enraged, angry, empty, and he tosses the candle at me like he's just tossing me the remote. I instantly go up in flames, and I spin up like at the speed of light, run to the main garage door, and I open it just enough for me to run out. And once my feet hit the grass, I dropped to, like everyone learned in elementary school, stop, drop, and roll. My neighbor runs to me. She's hitting me with her son's jacket, helping to put me out. And she's just screaming, "Oh my God, Audrey, oh my God, oh my God."
As the house went up in flames, the neighbor called 911.
Emergency dispatch. My neighbor was on fire. Your neighbor was on fire? What part of her body was injured? Her arms, she's bleeding. Her face and her arms? And the house is on fire, and her husband is inside. The house is on fire?
Our best information at the time was that Audrey may not survive. Chris was located by some bystanders just outside of the house in the backyard. He had a laceration to his neck, his wrist, and he also had a puncture wound on his left side.
Audrey and Chris were both airlifted to the nearest hospital. Audrey was almost fatally burned and barely conscious. And as she struggled to live, detectives began trying to shed light on Chris's horrific attack.
He told everybody, "Now I am the monster that she made me out to be."
The message he sent me was, "It's time for you to prove how much you love those kids."
On November 17, 2009, Audrey Mabry was in intensive care, desperately fighting for her life.
I couldn't believe he did that. I couldn't believe he did that to her, just because he couldn't have her.
When I first arrived at the scene, I didn't know what had happened. The neighbor told us that Chris had set Audrey on fire. I did find out he was one of the persons that was transported to the hospital. So we knew where he was.
Investigators immediately went to question Chris at the hospital, but he refused to talk. Meanwhile, detectives discovered Chris owned a van that was not parked at the house.
We located this van about a half a mile away out of view and parked at a community building that would lead me to believe that this was somewhat premeditated.
They also found several incriminating text messages Chris sent to friends and family just before the attack.
He said, "Now I am the monster that she made me out to be."
The text message he sent me was, "It's time for you to prove how much you love those kids." I thought he was gonna kill himself.
By the next day, investigators had enough evidence to place Chris under arrest for attempted murder.
The fact that Christopher had parked his personal vehicle about a half a mile from the incident scene. He had laid a blanket on the floor and used a candle from the bathroom. Those three items alone would indicate to me that this was a hastily devised plan.
It was 6 weeks before Audrey awoke from her medically induced coma. She was shocked to see she had been burned over 80% of her body.
When I looked at myself, I was absolutely devastated and then somehow determined that he was not going to rob me of what he wanted to rob me of. And that became my mission.
In the 3 months that followed, Audrey pushed through excruciating pain to relearn everyday tasks like walking. She also underwent 7 different trauma surgeries and skin grafts. Her main goal was to get back to her children and her life.
There were a lot of dark moments. It took me almost a year to get to a point where I saw a beautiful girl again, but not because she was all made up, but because she was repaired and renewed internally.
On January 24th, 2012, Chris Haney went to trial. He pleaded not guilty.
I was the first witness to go up. He looked me dead in my eye. It felt very surreal. I kept feeling my chest clench, and at one point I felt like I was gonna vomit.
Prosecutors contended that Chris set out to kill Audrey and then himself because he was distraught over losing her. And the jury agreed. Chris was convicted of attempted murder, aggravated battery, and arson. On March 2nd, 2012, Chris Haney was sentenced to life in prison plus 2 30-year terms, just 2 days after his divorce from Audrey was finalized.
When I look back, him being so manipulative and so controlling of my lifelong decisions, that's absolutely a sign of someone who is capable of domestic violence. I believe Chris did what he did because he was a man that felt that he had lost everything. Therefore, he was capable of anything.
Audrey has since moved on with her life, but she still battles the after effects of Chris's attack.
The heat and the sun is an extreme struggle for me. My range of motion is not the same. Being burned is something that is a very long recovery.
Even with her struggles, Audrey has gone back to school. She has also been in a healthy, happy relationship for more than a year.
Despite the horrible things she went through that day, Audrey is definitely more beautiful now than she's ever been. She has a new purpose in life.
My purpose is to give people hope, to show people that no matter what happens to you in life, you must persevere, and you never know your true strength until you're tested.
When Robin Bouchard met Kevin Cobb, she found herself on the fast track to becoming a wife and mother.
I was in love with Kevin, and I felt he was the love of my life.
But little could Robin know that Kevin was harboring a dangerous desire.
People would have never guessed that things were going on that weren't supposed to be.
A secret so terrible that after it surfaced, nothing would ever be the same again.
I just don't feel there's any crime out there more heinous than this one.
I was just sick. I couldn't fathom that he would even do this.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. They say love finds you when you least expect it. But small-town girl Robin Bouchard wasn't exactly looking to be found.
In the winter of '88, I was divorced about 6 months, and I was sitting home alone watching TV, and my girlfriends called me and said, "We're taking you out." They said, "You're going whether you want to or not." I was a little leery of it, but I was tired of sitting home on Saturday night.
Robin soon found herself at a local watering hole in her hometown in northern Maine. The 23-year-old had barely made it through the door when an attractive man named Kevin Cobb asked her to dance.
Well, I thought he was a very nice-looking man. He seemed to be a gentleman. And at the end of the night, he asked me for my phone number, and I did give it to him.
Within a few days, Kevin called to ask Robin out on an official first date.
Hello?
Kevin told Robin that he was a local construction contractor. He had previously been married and had 2 children.
We talked about, maybe having kids someday, and I was pleased that he still wanted to have kids.
Love quickly blossomed between Kevin and Robin. Before long, the two were inseparable.
He didn't want to see anybody else, I didn't want to see anybody else, and we just felt it was true love.
The young couple seemed like a perfect match, and just 4 months later, Kevin asked Robin to move in with him and his mother.
He lived with his mother and sister because he was recently divorced also. When I moved in with Kevin, I felt that, our relationship was moving forward.
And the whirlwind romance showed no signs of slowing down. In October of 1988, life handed Robin another pleasant surprise.
I found out that I was pregnant. I was in total shock, but I knew that, it was meant to be.
Robin and Kevin delighted in preparing for their first child together. But as Robin's pregnancy progressed, she began to notice a slight change in Kevin's behavior.
I worked at an office product store, and Kevin seemed to stop by more and more. I can remember one incident that I was actually bending over the counter to get something, and he said, I really shouldn't be doing that, with men in the store.
Kevin seemed determined to keep a close eye on Robin.
I thought it was cute, he was getting jealous.
But just weeks later, Kevin's jealousy seemed to take a back seat when he made a surprising suggestion to Robin.
Because we were still living with his mother and sister, and she smoked, and he didn't want the baby around cigarette smoke. He said, you really should move in with your parents. which I was happy to do, but I was also sad at the same time that he wouldn't have found a place for us to live as a family.
9 months pregnant, Robin prepared to move back home. And on Father's Day of 1989, she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Kayla.
I was super excited to have Kayla. I was just in awe. Kevin was a proud father, he seemed to be very happy that he had a little girl.
But those glowing moments would be fleeting when just 2 days later it came time for Robin to leave the hospital and Kevin.
My parents came and picked me up, and I was very happy to go home to them, but I was also sad that we weren't being, a family together.
Robin couldn't wait to reunite with Kevin once again. But over the next 18 years, the happy family life she dreamed of would completely unravel at the seams. One Saturday in January of 2007, Robin would make a horrific discovery.
Went into my daughter's room to change the bedding, and this notebook come flying out from the sheets, and the title was My Life, My Nightmare, Welcome to It. I started reading it. I was instantly sick to my stomach.
The words written in Kayla's journal would shock Robin to the core and instantly change her family's lives forever.
I had an instant feeling that something was wrong.
I just felt like, why didn't I know? Why didn't I see the signs?
In December of 1989, 17 years before Robin Bouchard would discover her family's secret nightmare, the young mother was busy raising a 6-month-old daughter with her long-distance boyfriend, Kevin Cobb.
We're living 2 hours apart, and I don't think he liked the part of either traveling to see me and Kayla or vice versa. He was starting to think that, maybe we should get a place now and settle down.
Kevin seemed ready to have his new family under one roof. That Christmas, he made his intentions clear with a special gift for Robin.
Kevin asked me to marry him. Of course, I said yes. I was feeling pretty good after that. We're finally going to make a commitment and actually all be together.
By the spring of 1990, Kevin fulfilled his promise by saving enough money to buy his family a home outside of Bangor, Maine. And that May, Robin and Kayla moved in with him.
When we moved in together, it was a happy time. Kevin was an awesome father. We were like a happy little family.
But Robin's seventh heaven would be short-lived. As the weeks went by, Kevin doted on their daughter Kayla, while Robin seemed to receive nothing but criticism.
I might have cooked all day long and make, a nice lasagna meal, but I forgot to make a salad. Oh, where's the salad? You can't have lasagna without a salad, or I didn't clean, the floor good enough, or I didn't make the bed just right.
Determined to keep peace within her family, Robin tried to justify Kevin's irrational behavior.
Sometimes I would, go to bed at night thinking, Robin, life's not that bad. Kevin's okay. He's just having a bad day.
By 1998, life for Robin and Kevin had become a bustling blur of hockey games and birthday parties. And while the couple still hadn't tied the knot, they seemed like a happy family on the outside. But behind closed doors, it was a very different story.
I always wanted, the storybook family and romance, and, I'd have that every now and then, but, when it was good, but when it was bad.
I remember my parents would fight. He would yell and raise his voice and call my mom names.
During our verbal disagreements, I would try to protect Kayla. I'd ask her to go to her room or, maybe go put a movie in so she couldn't hear us screaming at each other. I just didn't want her to grow up thinking that it was okay for a man to talk to a woman that way.
Despite her efforts, Robin was finding it increasingly difficult to keep Kevin happy. And by July 4th of 1998, their relationship had reached a breaking point.
We were home over the 4th of July at my parents' camp, and we were having a family party, and we always ate buffet style, and we told everybody, come help yourself, everything's ready, and Kevin expected me to get his plate, and I said, no, it's right here, come get it yourself. And so that made him mad.
As the night went on, Kevin's behavior only seemed to get worse.
He just kept drinking and he didn't eat, and he wanted to take Kayla to the fireworks. And everyone said, no, you're not taking her anywhere. You know, you've been drinking, you're not driving her anywhere. And it blew up from there. After the big fight, I said, that's it, no more. And I packed Kayla up and our dog up, and I said, I'm sorry, Kayla, I can't live this way anymore.
When we decided to leave for good, you know, I was really upset, and I was listening to the one song that my dad and I considered our song, and, you know, just staring at a picture of us, and just, I knew that we weren't gonna go back after that.
Robin moved into her parents' home with 9-year-old Kayla in tow. Free from Kevin's control, Robin felt the weight finally lift from her shoulders.
When I left Kevin, I became a stronger person. I could be me, and I was enjoying life again.
The future shined bright for Robin Bouchard, but she had no clue that someone else's horrors were just beginning.
It was never his fault. It was my fault. I took her away from him.
I was thinking, how could she be with this guy?
I needed to keep this secret, and I kept it from everyone.
By the fall of 1998, Robin Bouchard and her ex-boyfriend Kevin Cobb were sharing custody of their 9-year-old daughter, Kayla. Splitting up the family continued to weigh heavily on Robin.
Even though I didn't believe Kevin was a good man, I did believe he was a good father, and, you know, Kayla loved him and did want to spend time with him, so I wasn't going to take that away from them.
Robin and Kevin agreed that Kayla would visit her father every other weekend. But before long, Robin began to notice a change in her daughter.
I would pick her up and I noticed that she looked, you know, very tired, and she wanted to sleep on the way home and didn't want to talk about what they did.
I didn't really want to tell my mom what we were doing on the weekends. I just wanted my time with my dad, you know, to be with him, and I didn't really want to share it with anyone else.
I just figured they were staying up late, you know, watching hockey or playing hockey.
Robin tried to give her daughter the benefit of the doubt. By the time Kayla entered high school, any concerns Robin had about her teenage daughter seemed to be a thing of the past.
When Kayla was in high school, she was an honor roll student. Whatever sport there was, she was into it. She made me very proud.
The years had also been good to Robin, bringing her a new love.
In 2003, I met my current husband, John, and by 2004, we were engaged, planning our wedding, and was becoming a new family.
I'll never forget the day that I did meet her. I thought she was very beautiful, and we just kind of hit it off.
Robin was thrilled to show Kayla what a healthy relationship looked like. In April of 2004, Robin and John became husband and wife.
We were having a family again, so I was happy.
But the blissful days wouldn't last long. As Kayla entered her sophomore year in high school, Robin noticed a troubling change in her daughter's appearance.
I thought she was getting thin and wanted to be in her room a lot, and we'd try to tell her to come out, sit with us, watch a movie, and she would have an excuse. I just figured it was typical teenager stuff.
Robin tried not to worry, but before long, Kayla's excuses were beginning to have an effect outside the home.
She started saying, I'm not going to go to Dad's this weekend, I got a game, or I got practice, or, you know, I have to do something for my class, and it upset Kevin.
Kayla missing time with her father, we just thought that it was her busy schedule, and she had so much stuff going on, but we just thought it was natural.
But nothing was natural about what Robin Bouchard would discover just 2 years later by pure coincidence. One Saturday afternoon in January of 2007, Robin heard a strange sound coming from Kayla's room.
I noticed there was scratching at her bedroom door. So I said, oh darn, the dog must have got stuck in there. I opened up the door and I noticed that he wet on her bed. I went to go strip the sheets and this notebook come out from the sheets.
On the floor by Robin's feet lay a journal.
And the title was My Life, My Nightmare, Welcome to It. I'm like, why would Kayla be writing something like that? And I started reading it. And I became instantly sick and just fell to my knees.
In the pages of Kayla's secret journal, Robin learned that Kevin Cobb had been committing an unspeakable crime against their daughter.
I went and got my husband and I said, "You have to read this." I said, "Her father's been molesting her all these years."
According to the journal, Kevin had been molesting Kayla since she was 10. One of his last attempts had been on the night of Kayla's junior prom, when he had drugged his own daughter with muscle relaxers.
She lived two different lives. There was a life with me and a life she had with him, and she hid that life with him.
Robin was white as a ghost, and neither one of us kind of knew what to do at the moment.
Kayla was due home from work within the hour, and Robin had no idea what she was going to say when her daughter walked through the door.
If I was there while this was happening, I would never forgive myself.
My heart just kind of fell into my stomach, knowing that they probably read my darkest secrets of what was happening to me.
We're very determined to place Kevin under arrest.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In January of 2007, Robin Bouchard was struggling to comprehend what she had just discovered in her daughter's bedroom. A hidden journal detailed years of sexual abuse at the hands of Kayla's father and Robin's ex, Kevin Cobb.
I was guilt-stricken not knowing this was happening to her, and I was waiting for Kayla to get home from work so we could, show her that we knew and it was over.
When I walked through the door, it was an instant feeling that something was wrong. Then my mom, she held up my notebook that she found. My heart just kind of fell into my stomach, knowing that they probably read everything that was in my journal, my darkest secrets of what was happening to me.
Robin told Kayla that she had read the journal and believed every word of it.
She ran and leaped into our arms and we all cried, and I just kept telling her this wasn't her fault, it wasn't her fault. It's done, it's over, it's not gonna happen again.
Once we kind of came to, after we cried and holding each other for a little bit, we decided that, we were gonna make it stop.
The following day, with Kayla's permission, Robin called the Maine State Police to report Kevin's crime.
Sexual abuse cases are very difficult because many times they're he said, she said type of complaint. There isn't always physical evidence to go gather. And Kayla and Robin both seemed a little uncertain, a little scared, but they were ready to talk.
Robin explained that Kevin's abuse had been going on for the past 7 years.
The abuse started from Kevin when Kayla was the age of 10. He was giving her the wine coolers and the muscle relaxers to make her more willing to do what she had to do for him.
If he did drug me, I didn't have a chance to be afraid when he was actually abusing me. And, when he didn't drug me, that's when I would try to fight for myself and protect myself.
Robin told police that Kevin was in Florida for work. He wasn't due back until that coming May.
I knew there was no immediate danger of him being near her, and so it gave us plenty of time for the investigation to go through.
Detective Crane told us that we were gonna try to make recorded phone calls to my dad, and as much information I could get out of him as possible, a possible confession, anything that we could use in court would be, our best chance of having him prosecuted.
For the next 4 months, Kayla made recorded phone calls to Kevin in hopes that they would get some type of confession.
It was definitely overwhelming when I had to call my dad. It was just, I didn't necessarily know the words to say to him. That was kind of the hardest thing to, address it when, I had a detective sitting next to me.
It was torture just to listen to him talk to her. But I knew this was our only option, and I wanted him caught.
Around the 6th phone call in April of 2007, police finally got what they needed. Gathering all of her courage, Kayla asked her father why he would want to abuse her.
And he's like, "Oh, you don't have to worry about that again. I won't do that again. I just want to be your dad again." And the detective was giving her thumbs up that we had something on tape.
We were very determined to place Kevin under arrest for this offense. We felt we had the proof and the evidence we needed to prove it all the way through court.
On May 10th, 2007, when Kevin Cobb returned home to Bangor, Maine, police were waiting for him. He was promptly arrested and charged with gross sexual assault.
For Robin and Kayla, once he was arrested, there was some relief, but we had some work to do as the case was not over. It still had to move through the court system.
In June of 2008, after 3 days of intense testimony, Robin's family was more than ready for a verdict.
Kayla and I grabbed hands and we were squeezing tighter and tighter as the guilty, 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 guilty was coming out. We just knew the nightmare was over and she didn't ever have to face him again.
On June 13th, Kevin Kaw was convicted of 10 counts of gross sexual assault and 6 counts of unlawful sexual contact. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison.
We both teared up and hugged, and it was just like, you did it, you know. You put him away because of what he's done to you, and you can't do it to anybody else, and you probably saved another victim.
Today, Robin and Kayla have found ways to become survivors together.
You know, I think about it every day, but, you know, I'm doing better. Kayla's an amazing young lady, and she has moved forward and started her own organization called Breathe the Air, which stands for Abuse, Incest, and Rape.
She helps me with my organization, and she's always there to support me. She would do anything for me, and I think by helping me, it helps her as well.
Like Kayla, Robin continues to find peace and strength by sharing her story with others.
We have bonded through trying to help others now and hoping that no other mother and daughter have to go through what we went through.
It begins with a sound nobody remembers clearly, only the absence it left behind, the kind of silence that swells after a scream has already been swallowed by night, and in a quiet Florida neighborhood in the summer of 2003 that silence settled like heat, thick and unmoving, clinging to the street where porch lights stayed on longer than usual and windows remained shut long after dawn. Because something had happened here that refused to name itself, a moment that slipped through fingers and became a cold case before anyone dared to say the words out loud. The house stood ordinary, pale stucco, low roof, the sort of place you pass without looking twice, except that on this morning the front door was ajar, the kind of detail that pulls at instinct before reason catches up, and when police crossed the threshold they stepped into a scene that felt unfinished, as if the violence had been interrupted mid-thought, furniture displaced just enough to suggest struggle, a lamp overturned, a smear on the tile that looked like someone tried to steady themselves and failed, and in the back bedroom the victim lay still, time already beginning its quiet work of erasing edges. She was 32, a local name but not a famous one, someone who waved at neighbors, paid rent on time, kept her curtains open during the day, and in the language of police reports she became a single line, female, deceased, cause pending, while outside, word traveled faster than facts, neighbors gathering in small clusters, voices dropping, eyes darting toward the house, as if it might look back. The initial assessment spoke of forced entry, then hesitated, then crossed that out because the locks told a different story, and right there in that hesitation, the case began to bend. Detectives moved quickly at first, as they always do, canvassing doors, lifting prints, collecting fibers that would later sit in evidence bags labeled with dates that grew heavier with each passing year, and the questions came sharp and relentless. Who saw her last? Who spoke to her the night before? Who had reason? Who had opportunity? Who knew the layout of the house well enough to move through it without knocking over more than a single lamp? Answers came fragmented, inconsistent, wrapped in the static of rumor and fear, and every statement seemed to open 2 more doors while closing none. The autopsy provided facts but no comfort, time of death narrowed but not precise, injuries consistent with a close encounter, no weapon recovered, and a trace under the fingernails that hinted at a struggle, a microscopic promise that someday science might speak where witnesses could not. For now, it was cataloged and shelved, another future hope sealed in plastic, while detectives chased leads that flickered brightly and died just as fast. An ex-boyfriend questioned and released, a co-worker cleared, a neighbor with a temper scrutinized until his alibi held firm. Each name crossed off, leaving the list shorter, but the mystery deeper. By the end of that first week, the headlines had shifted from urgency to unease, from breaking news to cautious speculation, and the phrase cold case began to hover unspoken, a threat rather than a label, because nobody wanted to admit that the trail was already cooling, that the scent was fading, that Florida's relentless sun was doing what it always does, bleaching details, softening memories, encouraging people to move on. The family did not move on. They stood at the edge of the investigation, calling daily, asking the same questions, hearing the same careful answers, watching hope stretch thin and translucent. Months passed, then years, and the case file grew thicker without growing clearer, supplemented by tips that arrived late at night and led nowhere, by psychics offering visions, by anonymous letters that promised everything and delivered nothing, each addition a weight that pressed down on the truth rather than lifting it. Detectives rotated out, promotions, retirements, new faces reading old notes, trying to hear urgency in handwriting that had long since lost its heat, and the victim's name became something spoken in past tense even by those who loved her most. The neighborhood changed, houses repainted, families moved in and out. Children who once rode bikes past the crime scene grew up and left, and still the question lingered like humidity. Who did this? And how did they vanish so completely, leaving behind a crime that refused to close its mouth? Evidence sat in storage, the biological trace under the fingernails preserved but mute, technology not yet ready to ask the right questions, and the case slipped officially into cold status, a classification that sounds clinical but feels like a verdict. Then, quietly, almost apologetically, time caught up. Advances in DNA analysis, the kind that turn fragments into profiles, whispers into names, arrived not with sirens but with paperwork, and a detective revisiting the file noticed that promise again, that sealed plastic, that note in the margin that said hold for future testing. It was a long shot, everyone knew that, but cold cases live on long shots, and when the sample was finally processed, the result was not a name but a number, a partial profile entered into a system that waited patiently, year after year, for a match that might never come. The wait was longer than anyone admitted, punctuated by moments of false alarm and long stretches of nothing, until one morning, nearly 2 decades after the night that started it all, a notification arrived without drama, a hit, not a perfect one, but close enough to matter, close enough to reopen doors that had been shut so long they creaked in protest. The profile linked not to a suspect from 2003 but to someone tangential, a relative, a distant connection, a thread that led investigators away from the familiar and into territory nobody had considered back when memories were fresh and fear was loud. Names resurfaced that had never been on the list, faces aged by time rather than suspicion, and quietly, methodically, detectives rebuilt the case from the ground up, aligning old evidence with new possibilities, re-interviewing witnesses who now spoke with the looseness that comes from believing the worst is long behind them. Details once dismissed took on new weight, a comment about a car parked oddly that night, a figure seen briefly under a streetlight, a memory that had been filed away as unreliable now fitting too neatly to ignore. The suspect, when he finally emerged from the haze of years, was not a monster lurking in shadows but a man who had lived openly, worked steadily, blended in so well that his name had never sparked alarm, and when investigators placed him under surveillance, they watched a life that appeared unremarkable, the banality almost offensive in its contrast to the violence it concealed. A sample was collected discreetly, legally, the kind of procedural step that carries enormous weight and must be executed without error, because after 20 years there is no margin for mistakes. When the lab results came back, they did not arrive with celebration, only confirmation, a match strong enough to turn probability into certainty, to transform a cold case into a solved one, to take a ghost and give it a face. The arrest, when it happened, shocked the community precisely because it did not look like justice arriving, no chase, no spectacle, just handcuffs in a parking lot. A man led away while bystanders stared, trying to reconcile the headline they would read later with the ordinary scene unfolding in front of them. And yet, for all that closure promised, something remained unsettled, a lingering chill that refused to dissipate, because solving a case does not rewind time, it does not restore what was taken, it only sharpens the outline of loss, making it impossible to look away. In Florida, the heat still pressed down, the neighborhood still slept, and the house where it all began had long since been repainted, sold, inhabited by people who knew nothing of the silence that once settled there, while the story, finally named, finally anchored, continued to echo, reminding everyone that even after 20 years, the past can still reach out and demand to be heard. The arrest did not end the story. It only changed its temperature, because once the name was spoken out loud, the case seemed to inhale for the first time in 20 years, pulling in every unanswered question it had been holding, and investigators understood immediately that identifying the killer was not the same as understanding him. Not the same as explaining how a man could move through life unseen while carrying the gravity of that night in 2003. The suspect sat across from detectives in a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old air, his posture calm, almost rehearsed, eyes steady in a way that felt practiced rather than innocent, and when they began to speak his name in connection with a cold case, there was no visible shock, only a tightening at the corners of his mouth that suggested recognition rather than surprise. They started where all interrogations begin, with the easy facts: where he lived then, where he worked, how well he knew the area, and each answer slid neatly into place. Too neat, mapping onto the geography of the crime with unsettling precision, his job placing him within minutes of the victim's home, his routine explaining why he would have been awake at the hour of death, his familiarity with the neighborhood answering questions about how someone could approach without raising alarm. Detectives listened without interruption, letting the rhythm of his voice establish itself, noting how he spoke about 2003 not as a distant memory, but as a chapter he had revisited often, the details too crisp for someone who claimed it was just another year. When they introduced the DNA evidence, the air shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly, a subtle recalibration, his gaze dropping briefly before returning, and in that moment the room felt smaller, as if the walls were leaning in to hear what would come next. He asked questions that betrayed understanding, about probabilities, about contamination, about how long samples last in storage, questions that suggested foresight, preparation, a man who had followed the slow march of forensic science with personal interest. Detectives exchanged glances that carried more weight than words, because this was not the reaction of someone learning about a cold case for the first time. Outside the interrogation room, the case file expanded again, not with speculation but with context, as investigators dug into the suspect's past, discovering patterns that had gone unnoticed because no one had been looking for them. Old complaints surfaced, dismissed at the time as misunderstandings, neighbors recalling arguments that never escalated enough to call police, co-workers mentioning a temper controlled just tightly enough to avoid consequence, ex-partners describing moments of fear they had rationalized away because nothing bad ever followed, until now those fragments aligned into a shape that felt disturbingly complete. The victim's timeline was reconstructed with new intensity, her final day replayed minute by minute, phone records examined, receipts revisited, the mundane acts of living transformed into clues, and what emerged was a portrait of someone unaware that the ordinary choices she made that evening would later be scrutinized under the harshest light. She had returned home later than usual, spoken briefly with a friend, mentioned nothing out of the ordinary, and somewhere in that narrow window between routine and rest, she crossed paths with a man whose presence would remain invisible for 2 decades. Investigators theorized entry without force, a knock that did not raise suspicion, perhaps a request, perhaps a familiar face, because fear rarely announces itself loudly. It often arrives wearing normalcy, and once inside, the situation escalated with the speed and violence suggested by the scene, the overturned lamp no longer an isolated detail, but a marker of the exact moment control slipped. The lack of a recovered weapon now felt intentional rather than accidental, an effort to erase rather than a failure to find, and the absence of witnesses spoke not to luck but to timing, to someone who understood how thin the margins were between discovery and escape. As the interrogation continued over multiple sessions, the suspect's story shifted in small ways, never dramatically enough to justify accusation on its own, but inconsistently enough to create friction, timelines adjusting by minutes, explanations gaining unnecessary detail, alibis softening at the edges, and each change was documented, compared, weighed. Because in cold cases the truth often emerges not from a single confession, but from the slow accumulation of contradictions. He denied knowing the victim well, then admitted to seeing her occasionally, denied being inside the house, then spoke about its layout with uncomfortable accuracy, denied anger, then described the argument in tones that suggested it had been replayed in his mind many times. Meanwhile, the community reacted to the news with a mixture of relief and disbelief, the shock of recognition rippling outward as people connected the headline to the face they thought they knew, conversations filling with hindsight, every small interaction reevaluated, every memory recast under the shadow of what was now undeniable. For some, the arrest reopened wounds they had carefully sealed. For others, it confirmed a suspicion they had never voiced, and for many it introduced a new anxiety, the realization that danger does not always look dangerous, that it can wear familiarity like camouflage. Prosecutors moved carefully, aware that time was both ally and enemy, that memories fade but evidence endures, and they began building a case designed not just to accuse, but to withstand the scrutiny that inevitably follows long-delayed justice. They mapped the DNA trail meticulously, explaining how the partial match led to genealogical research, how family trees were constructed, how the suspect emerged statistically before he ever emerged physically, a process that transformed anonymity into inevitability. Every step was documented, every method prepared for challenge, because after 20 years, doubt is the defense's most powerful tool. The suspect was charged, the words reading heavy on paper, first-degree murder, a phrase that carried the weight of a life interrupted and a community haunted, and yet, even as the legal machinery began to turn, questions lingered about motive, about the exact sequence of events, about what had been said in that house before violence erased the conversation. Detectives returned to the scene one last time, not to search but to remember, standing in rooms now filled with different furniture, different lives, imagining the moment when everything fractured, trying to reconcile the quiet present with the violent past. The victim's family attended the arraignment in silence, their expressions a study in restrained emotion, because grief that has lasted 20 years does not erupt easily. It settles into a steady ache, and seeing the man accused of ending her life did not provide the release some had promised, only a confirmation that the waiting had not been in vain. They listened as dates were set, as procedures were outlined, as the case formally transitioned from cold file to active prosecution, a transformation that felt both monumental and strangely anticlimactic. As the suspect was led away, the camera flashes captured an image that would circulate widely, a face that now symbolized both resolution and horror, and yet for investigators, the work was far from over, because solving a cold case does not erase its complexity, it magnifies it, demanding answers not just to what happened, but to how it was allowed to remain hidden for so long. In the quiet moments after the courtroom emptied, detectives returned to their notes, their timelines, their evidence, aware that the next phase would test not only the strength of their case, but the patience of a community that had waited 20 years to hear the truth spoken aloud. As the case moved toward trial, the passage of time became an active presence rather than a backdrop, pressing against every decision, every recollection, every piece of evidence that had survived 2 decades of storage and neglect, and the prosecution understood that they were not only arguing against the defense, but against forgetting itself. Court filings accumulated like sediment, layers of history compacted into legal language, and within them the story of 2003 was being rewritten with the precision demanded by a jury that had lived through none of it. Witness lists were revisited, names highlighted and crossed out, some people unreachable now, others reluctant, their memories dulled by years of distance, yet when called, Certain details emerged with startling clarity, the kind that trauma preserves intact. A neighbor described the sound she heard that night, not a scream but a sharp noise, a sudden interruption of routine that she had dismissed because Florida nights are full of sudden sounds, doors slamming, arguments flaring and fading, and only later did that memory become unbearable, replaying endlessly with new meaning. Forensic experts prepared to explain the science that had transformed a trace into an accusation, rehearsing testimony that would translate complex probability into plain language, emphasizing how the sample collected in 2003 had been protected, how it had waited silently for technology to catch up, and how genealogical analysis did not guess but narrowed, refined, eliminated until only one path remained. They knew the defense would challenge everything: contamination, chain of custody, the ethics of familial searching, and each challenge was met with documentation, timestamps, signatures, the paper trail of a system determined to justify its own evolution. The defense, for its part, framed the case as a cautionary tale, a story about desperation leading investigators to retrofit evidence to a convenient suspect, highlighting the absence of direct witnesses, the lack of a weapon, the inconsistencies in recollections that had aged beyond reliability. They spoke of reasonable doubt as if it were a living thing, growing stronger with every passing year, and they pointed to the suspect's decades of freedom as proof that he could not be the monster now described, asking the jury to consider how easily a life can be rewritten by accusation alone. Yet the prosecution returned again and again to the physical reality of the crime scene, to the layout of the house, to the pattern of movement suggested by overturned objects, to the biological trace that had refused to disappear, and they argued that time had not weakened the truth, but clarified it, stripping away noise until only what mattered remained. They presented timelines that converged, placing the suspect where he could not explain away his presence, aligning his own statements against each other, letting contradictions speak louder than accusations. Outside the courtroom, the community followed each development with the intensity of people reliving a story they thought had ended, local news revisiting old footage, photographs of the victim appearing again on screens, her image frozen at an age she never surpassed, while the suspect's more recent face filled the frame beside it, a visual collision of past and present that felt almost cruel in its symmetry. Conversations reignited, debates sharpened, and the town existed in a suspended state, waiting to see whether the long-promised closure would hold. As testimony unfolded, the emotional weight shifted, not dramatically but inexorably, from abstraction to intimacy, from evidence to impact, and when the victim's family took the stand, the courtroom grew still, their words measured but heavy, describing the void left behind, the birthdays marked by absence, the way hope had been rationed carefully over 20 years, never spent all at once for fear it would run out. Their presence reminded the jury that the case was not an exercise in theory, but the record of a life interrupted, a grief prolonged by uncertainty. The suspect listened without visible reaction, his expression controlled, and that restraint became its own point of contention, interpreted by some as composure, by others as coldness, because in a trial shaped by time, perception carried enormous weight. Every gesture was scrutinized, every glance parsed, as if the truth might leak out through body language, where words refused to go. The judge intervened frequently, reminding the jury to focus on evidence rather than emotion, a necessary instruction that nevertheless felt inadequate in the face of so much history. Behind the scenes, investigators revisited one final angle, a piece of circumstantial evidence that had never quite fit, a late-night sighting reported years ago and dismissed as unreliable, now re-examined with fresh eyes. They tracked down the witness, older now, cautious but willing, and when she spoke, her account aligned with the revised timeline in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation, placing the suspect's vehicle near the scene at a critical moment. The detail was small, but in a case built on accumulation, small details could tip the balance. As closing arguments approached, both sides distilled their narratives, the prosecution framing the case as a testament to persistence and the eventual reach of justice, the defense warning against the seduction of certainty built on science that had not existed at the time of the crime. They spoke to the jury's responsibility to the weight of deciding not just guilt or innocence, but the meaning of 20 lost years. And in that charged atmosphere, the cold case finally shed its label, becoming something immediate, urgent, alive. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom emptied slowly, as if reluctant to release the tension that had accumulated there, and outside, the Florida air pressed in, heavy and unchanged, a reminder that while people age and systems evolve, the places where violence occurs remain stubbornly present. The house, the street, the night itself had outlasted every theory and every doubt, and now the truth, whatever it was, waited behind closed doors, measured not in years but in hours, as a community held its breath, aware that the verdict, when it came, would not only judge one man but finally define the story they had been telling themselves since 2003. The hours of deliberation stretched without sound, the kind of silence that amplifies every footstep in the hallway, every rustle of paper, and inside the jury room the past was being dismantled and rebuilt piece by piece. Evidence weighed not in isolation but against the long shadow of time that had followed this cold case into the present. When the verdict finally came, it arrived without ceremony, carried on the steady voice of a foreperson who understood that no arrangement of words could fully absorb what was about to be said.
Guilty.
The word landed with a finality that felt both overdue and unsettling, because it did not end the story, it simply fixed it in place. The courtroom reacted in fragments rather than waves, a hand gripping a railing, a breath released too quickly, a head bowed not in triumph but in exhaustion, and the suspect, now the convicted killer, absorbed the verdict with the same controlled stillness he had maintained throughout the trial, as if the outcome confirmed something he had already accepted long ago. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date, another pause in a process defined by waiting, and as the room cleared, the weight of resolution settled unevenly, heavier on some than others. In the days that followed, attention turned inward, toward understanding rather than proving, and investigators revisited the question that had hovered since the arrest. Why now? Why this crime? Why this victim? Patterns emerged that had been invisible when the focus was narrower, a convergence of stressors in the killer's life at the time, financial instability, personal rejection, a sense of grievance that had no outlet until it found one in violence. None of it excused the act, but it traced a line that made the unimaginable disturbingly comprehensible, and in that comprehension lay a new kind of discomfort. The sentencing hearing reopened wounds the verdict had barely begun to close, victim impact statements filling the courtroom with stories that had waited decades to be heard. Family members spoke of lives shaped by absence, of choices made in the shadow of not knowing, of the quiet anger that had fueled their persistence when the world had moved on. Their words did not seek revenge so much as recognition, an acknowledgement that the cold case had never been cold to them, only unresolved, and as they spoke, the killer stared forward, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than any denial. When the sentence was pronounced, life without parole, it carried a symbolic weight beyond the legal, a declaration that time had not diminished accountability, that aging does not absolve violence, that the distance between 2003 and now could be crossed, if only once, by the machinery of justice. The killer was led away, his future narrowed to routines and walls, while outside, cameras captured the aftermath, headlines declaring closure, resolution, and end. Yet within the community, reactions were more complex, relief braided with unease, because certainty, once achieved, invites reflection. Journalists revisited the case with new angles, examining how it had gone unsolved for so long, questioning missed opportunities, procedural limitations, and the human errors that had allowed a perpetrator to live freely for 20 years. Former detectives spoke candidly about the constraints of their era, about how evidence that now seems decisive once sat inert, and their honesty reframed the narrative from failure to patience, from neglect to the slow alignment of tools and timing. Still, the question lingered, whether anything could have been done sooner, whether different choices might have shortened the wait for justice. The neighborhood felt the verdict in subtle ways, conversations quieter, glances more searching, an awareness that familiarity is not protection. People revisited memories with new caution, wondering how often they had crossed paths with a killer, how close they had come without knowing, and that proximity unsettled them more than the crime itself. It suggested that danger does not announce itself, that it can blend seamlessly into the rhythms of daily life, and that realization altered how the community understood both the past and itself. Investigators closed the file with care, archiving documents, logging evidence, finalizing reports that would now serve as record rather than roadmap, and for them, the satisfaction of resolution was tempered by humility, an acknowledgement of the forces beyond control that shape outcomes. They spoke of the case not as a triumph, but as a lesson, one that underscored the importance of preservation, of patience, of believing that even when progress stalls, the story is not finished. The cold case label was removed, replaced by a final status that felt definitive yet fragile. For the victim's family, closure arrived not as a single moment, but as a gradual easing, the knowledge of truth providing a foundation upon which grief could finally settle into something stable. They visited the grave with a different posture now, speaking aloud to a daughter and sister whose story had been reclaimed from uncertainty, and while the loss remained absolute, the question that had haunted every year no longer demanded an answer. That silence, unlike the one that began the case, felt earned. And still, as the town returned to its routines, the echoes of 2003 persisted, a reminder that justice, when delayed, reshapes everyone it touches. The house remained, the street unchanged, the Florida nights heavy with the same heat, but now the story carried a name, a verdict, a sentence, and in that naming, the community found both relief and a sobering truth, that even when a cold case is solved, its shadow does not disappear, it simply learns how to rest. Even after the sentence was handed down and the courthouse emptied, the case refused to settle quietly into history, because some stories do not end when the law stops speaking, they continue in the spaces between headlines, in the late-night conversations and private reckonings that follow public closure. The Florida cold case had been solved, the killer identified and confined, yet the question that lingered was not whether justice had been done, but what justice meant after so much time had passed. For detectives who had inherited the case rather than begun it, resolution carried a peculiar weight, the satisfaction of completing a task paired with the awareness that they had arrived at the end of a road paved by others' efforts and failures. They reviewed the investigation one final time, mapping its long arc from the first frantic hours in 2003 to the measured certainty of a conviction, and what stood out was not a single mistake, but a series of limitations, technology that could not yet speak, databases that did not exist, assumptions that felt reasonable until they were proven incomplete. In that reflection, the case became less a story of delay and more a record of evolution, of how justice depends not only on intent, but on tools. The genealogical DNA method that ultimately unlocked the mystery became a focal point of discussion, hailed by some as revolutionary and questioned by others as invasive, and the debate spilled beyond the courtroom into public forums and policy meetings. Supporters pointed to the undeniable outcome, a murderer identified after 20 years of anonymity, while critics raised concerns about privacy, about the reach of the state into family trees of people who had committed no crime. The case, once local and personal, now carried implications far beyond the neighborhood where it began, influencing how future cold cases might be pursued. Meanwhile, the killer's past was dissected with forensic curiosity, journalists and analysts retracing his steps through the years he spent free, looking for signs that had been missed, moments where intervention might have altered the trajectory. They found a man who blended in with unsettling ease, maintaining employment, relationships, routines, his capacity for violence compartmentalized so effectively that it left no obvious trace. This duality fascinated and disturbed in equal measure, challenging the comforting belief that monsters are visibly different, that evil announces itself in ways that can be recognized and avoided. Former acquaintances came forward with memories newly colored by the verdict, recounting interactions that had once seemed unremarkable but now carried an edge of menace, a joke that felt cruel in retrospect, an argument that escalated too quickly, a look that lingered too long. These recollections did not change the outcome, but they reshaped the narrative, suggesting that the truth had been present in fragments all along, scattered across years and relationships, waiting for context to assemble it into something coherent. The victim's life, once reduced to evidence and testimony, began to re-emerge in fuller form, friends and family sharing stories that had been overshadowed by the crime, emphasizing who she was beyond the night she died. She was remembered for her habits, her laugh, her plans, the small details that had no place in a police file but defined her existence. This reclamation felt necessary, a counterbalance to the singular focus on how she was lost, reminding the community that solving the cold case was not only about identifying a killer, but about restoring dimension to a life flattened by violence. As years of uncertainty finally loosened their grip, the family navigated a complicated emotional landscape, relief intertwined with a grief that now had room to move. Some described feeling lighter. Others spoke of anger resurfacing, now directed not at an unknown assailant, but at a specific person, a target that made the emotion sharper rather than softer. Therapists and counselors noted how delayed resolution can fracture the grieving process, forcing it to restart years later, and the family's experience became a quiet example of how justice, even when achieved, demands its own form of healing. The house where the crime occurred gained renewed attention, its address circulating again, strangers driving past, drawn by morbid curiosity, while current occupants found themselves unwilling participants in a story they had not chosen. Eventually, interest faded, as it always does, but the brief resurgence highlighted how physical spaces absorb narrative, becoming landmarks of memory regardless of renovation or ownership. The walls had changed, the paint was new, but the association endured, a reminder that places, like people, carry scars invisible to those who do not know where to look. Law enforcement agencies across the state took note, reviewing their own cold cases with renewed urgency, inventorying evidence that might now be testable, reassessing files that had been set aside as unsolvable. The Florida case became a reference point, cited in training sessions and internal memos as proof that patience and preservation matter, that a sample collected today might speak volumes decades later. This ripple effect extended the impact of the case beyond its immediate resolution, influencing how future investigations would be conducted and remembered. Yet amid the progress and reflection, a quieter truth persisted, that no amount of procedural success could return what had been taken or erase the years lived in uncertainty. The solved cold case did not rewrite history, it clarified it, imposing a definitive shape on events that had once been fluid and terrifyingly open-ended. That shape brought stability, but it also fixed the loss in place, making it impossible to imagine alternate endings, a trade-off that the family accepted because the alternative, endless doubt, had proven far worse. As time moved forward again, unburdened by the constant anticipation of answers, the community settled into a new normal, one that incorporated the case rather than revolved around it. Conversations about the crime became less frequent, less charged, eventually giving way to other concerns, other stories, because even the most shocking events must eventually coexist with daily life. And yet, beneath that return to routine, the knowledge remained, a shared understanding that justice, though delayed, had arrived, altering the collective memory of 2003 from one of unresolved horror to one of hard-won clarity. The Florida cold case, once defined by absence, now existed as a complete narrative, its beginning and end connected across 20 years by perseverance, science, and an unwillingness to let silence stand unchallenged. It served as both warning and reassurance, a testament to how easily violence can hide and how relentlessly it can be pursued, and in that dual message lay its enduring power. Even solved, the case continued to speak, not loudly, but persistently, reminding anyone who listened that the past is never truly gone. It waits, patient and intact, until the moment it is finally understood. With the case officially closed, attention shifted from discovery to consequence, from the mechanics of justice to the quieter, more complex question of what comes after, and for those who had lived under the shadow of the crime, that transition proved anything but simple. Closure, so often promised in headlines, revealed itself not as an ending but as a change in shape, grief reconfigured rather than erased, the absence still present but no longer accompanied by the constant ache of uncertainty. The victim's family described the months following the verdict as disorienting, the long habit of waiting suddenly obsolete, replaced by a need to rebuild routines that had been structured around hope and vigilance. Some found solace in advocacy, lending their voices to cold case initiatives, speaking about the importance of evidence preservation and funding for forensic innovation, while others retreated, choosing privacy after years of public attention. Their divergent paths reflected a shared truth that resolution does not standardize healing, it individualizes it, forcing each person to renegotiate their relationship with the past. For the investigators most closely involved, the case lingered as well, surfacing unexpectedly in quiet moments, during training sessions, or when new cold cases crossed their desks bearing familiar hallmarks. They spoke of the Florida investigation as a reminder of humility, of how easily certainty can harden too early, and how crucial it is to leave room for future answers. The solved case became a teaching tool, not a trophy, illustrating the balance between urgency and patience that defines effective law enforcement. Public reaction evolved over time, the initial shock giving way to discussion, then to reflection, and finally to a kind of collective fatigue, as the community absorbed the lesson that justice does not always align with narrative satisfaction. Online forums that once buzzed with speculation quieted, debates about guilt and method gradually replaced by broader conversations about privacy, technology, and the ethics of retroactive investigation. The case had outgrown its origins, becoming a reference point in discussions far removed from the street where it began. The killer's incarceration introduced its own complexities, as appeals were filed and procedural challenges mounted, not with the expectation of reversal but as an assertion of rights that persist even after conviction. Legal briefs revisited arguments about DNA genealogy, about due process and consent, and while courts consistently upheld the verdict, each motion reopened public discourse, reminding observers that justice is not a single moment, but an ongoing process subject to scrutiny and revision. Inside prison walls, the man who had once moved invisibly through the community now lived under constant observation, his anonymity replaced by a notoriety that stripped away the camouflage he had relied on for decades. Reports suggested he maintained a low profile, neither confessing nor proclaiming innocence, a posture that left many questions unanswered, particularly those concerning motive and remorse. For the victim's family, that silence became a final barrier, an absence that no verdict could fill, because understanding why often matters as much as knowing who. Meanwhile, the evidence that had anchored the case took on a symbolic life of its own, the preserved samples cited in academic journals and law enforcement conferences as an example of foresight rewarded. It became a quiet argument for patience, a counterpoint to the pressure for immediate results, demonstrating that the value of evidence is not always measured in days or months, but sometimes in decades. This reframing influenced policy decisions, encouraging agencies to invest in long-term storage and data management, changes that promise to shape future investigations in unseen ways. The house at the center of the crime gradually receded from public consciousness, its address no longer trending, its past known only to those who sought it out deliberately. New occupants lived within its walls, unaware or resigned, the space reclaimed by ordinary life, laughter, routine, the mundane acts that assert themselves even in places marked by tragedy. This quiet reclamation offered a subtle reassurance that while violence leaves traces, it does not permanently define the spaces it touches. As anniversaries passed, the date of the crime transformed from a focal point of dread into a marker of resilience, observed privately rather than publicly, the family choosing remembrance over spectacle. They spoke of the victim in present terms, as someone whose influence continued rather than ended, a shift made possible by the certainty the verdict provided. Without unanswered questions pulling them backward, memory could move forward, reshaping loss into legacy. The broader implications of the case continued to unfold, influencing legislation and funding decisions aimed at addressing the backlog of cold cases nationwide. Lawmakers reference the Florida investigation when arguing for expanded forensic resources, citing it as proof that delayed justice is not denied justice, provided the system remains committed to preservation and review. The case thus extended its reach into policy, shaping environments far removed from its origin. And through all of this, the story maintained a quiet gravity, a reminder that behind every solved case lies a long period of not knowing, years defined by waiting rather than answers. The Florida cold case, now resolved, carried that history within it, a testament to the endurance of both grief and determination. Its resolution did not erase the past, it reframed it, offering clarity where there had been only shadow, and in doing so, it underscored a simple, unsettling truth, that time, though relentless, can be outpaced by persistence, and that even after decades of silence, the truth retains its voice, waiting patiently to be heard. As the years pressed forward beyond the verdict, the case continued to exert a quiet pull, resurfacing not as breaking news, but as a reference, a cautionary echo that appeared whenever discussions turned to cold cases left waiting in evidence rooms across the country. Investigators from other jurisdictions reached out, requesting insight, asking what had been preserved, what had nearly been lost, what small decisions in 2003 had ultimately made the difference 20 years later. The Florida case became less about one crime and more about a philosophy, the belief that unresolved violence should never be treated as finished business. Training seminars cited the investigation as an example of restraint, of resisting the urge to discard what seems useless in the moment, and younger officers listened with a seriousness shaped by the knowledge that the choices they make early in their careers might echo long after they retire. The idea that a single swab, properly labeled and stored, could one day speak louder than dozens of interviews reframed how they understood their role, shifting emphasis from immediate resolution to long-term accountability. In that reframing, the case gained a second life, one that extended beyond its original victims and perpetrators. The victim's story continued to circulate as well, not in the lurid terms that often dominate true crime narratives, but as a reminder of the human cost behind procedural debates. Advocacy groups highlighted her case when arguing for victim-centered approaches to long-term investigations, emphasizing how families are forced to live in a state of suspended grief when answers are withheld by circumstance rather than neglect. Her name, once spoken only in whispers of uncertainty, became associated with perseverance, a symbol of what can happen when cases are allowed to remain open in spirit even when officially closed. For the community, the solved cold case altered collective memory in subtle ways, changing how people spoke about the early 2000s, how they remembered the fear that had briefly tightened its grip on the neighborhood before fading into the background of everyday life. The knowledge that the threat had been real, specific, and nearby prompted a reevaluation of that period, a recognition that the calm that followed had been built on ignorance rather than safety. This retrospective awareness did not provoke panic, but it instilled a sober respect for how quickly normalcy can fracture. Local law enforcement agencies conducted internal audits, revisiting older unsolved files with renewed attention, prioritizing those with preserved biological evidence, and in doing so, they uncovered patterns of neglect not born of indifference, but of limitation. Storage rooms were reorganized, inventories digitized, and forgotten boxes brought back into the light, each one a potential voice waiting to be heard. The Florida case loomed over these efforts as both inspiration and indictment, proof of what is possible and reminder of what is at stake when patience runs out too soon. The killer's appeals continued quietly, procedural motions moving through the system with predictable outcomes, and while none altered the sentence, their existence served as a reminder that the legal process does not conclude with a verdict. For the victim's family, each filing reopened a sliver of anxiety, a reflex honed by years of uncertainty, but the finality of the evidence provided a stability they had not known before. The fear of reversal never fully disappeared, but it no longer dominated their lives. In academic circles, the case found its way into curricula discussed not for its sensational elements, but for its methodological implications. Students examined the timeline, the preservation of evidence, the ethical considerations of genealogical searches, and the psychological toll on families and investigators alike. The story became a case study in patience and restraint, a counter-narrative to the expectation of instant answers, challenging future professionals to think beyond the urgency of headlines. The house, once a focal point of dread, slipped further into anonymity, its past now a footnote rather than a defining feature, and this fading felt appropriate, even necessary. Physical reminders of violence can trap communities in cycles of fixation, but as memory recedes into record, space is created for renewal. The street resumed its ordinary rhythm, children playing, cars passing, life asserting itself with quiet insistence, a testament to the resilience of places as much as people. Anniversaries of the crime were no longer marked by public vigils or media retrospectives, but by private moments of remembrance, the family choosing to honor the victim in ways that emphasized continuity rather than loss. They spoke of her plans, her humor, her presence in their lives, shifting focus away from the night she died and toward the year she lived, a reorientation made possible by the certainty that had finally been secured. This shift did not erase pain, but it redefined it, allowing memory to function without constantly reopening wounds. The broader public gradually moved on, as it always does, drawn to new stories, new mysteries, yet the Florida cold case retained a quiet permanence, resurfacing whenever discussions turned to the limits of justice and the persistence required to overcome them. It stood as a reminder that resolution is not always swift, that answers can arrive long after attention has faded, and that patience, though often portrayed as passive, can be an active, deliberate choice. In the end, the case did not conclude with a dramatic final note, but with a sustained resonance, an understanding that some truths take time to mature, to separate themselves from noise and confusion. The Florida cold case, solved after 20 years, settled into history not as a cautionary tale alone, but as evidence of endurance, of the idea that even when silence stretches across decades, it is not infinite, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, retains the capacity to surface, demand recognition, and finally be named. Time continued its quiet work after the case faded from headlines, smoothing the sharpest edges while leaving the core intact, and in that softened space the meaning of the Florida cold case began to change again, less about revelation and more about consequence. What had once been a story of mystery and pursuit became a reference point for accountability, invoked whenever discussions turned to what society owes its dead and the living left behind. The solved case lingered not because it shocked, but because it endured, a reminder that some truths demand patience rather than urgency. For the victim's family, life after resolution unfolded in stages, each marked by subtle shifts rather than dramatic turns. They spoke of moments when they realized the case no longer defined every decision, when conversations drifted naturally without circling back to the crime, when the future felt less conditional. These realizations arrived unexpectedly during ordinary activities, a shared meal, a quiet drive, and their significance lay in how unremarkable they felt. Normalcy, once elusive, returned without announcement, signaling that grief had finally found a stable rhythm. The killer's name, once spoken with intensity, gradually lost its power, receding into court documents and archival footage, while the victim's identity grew stronger, reclaimed through stories that emphasized her presence rather than her absence. Friends who had drifted apart during years of uncertainty reconnected, bonded by the shared understanding that the past no longer needed to dominate the present. In this rebalancing, the narrative shifted away from the perpetrator, an intentional act that restored agency to those who had been overshadowed by violence. Law enforcement agencies continued to feel the case's influence in quieter ways, policy adjustments implemented without fanfare, training modules updated to emphasize long-term thinking, supervisors reminding younger officers that the value of evidence is not always immediate. The Florida case became shorthand for patience, a phrase invoked when budget pressures or caseloads threatened to push unsolved files into obscurity. It reinforced the idea that unresolved does not mean irrelevant, that every preserved detail is a conversation deferred rather than abandoned. Public understanding of cold cases evolved alongside these institutional changes, with the Florida investigation often cited in discussions about the intersection of technology and justice. Media coverage became more nuanced, acknowledging both the promise and the limits of forensic advances and cautioning against the expectation that every unsolved crime will eventually yield to science. The case illustrated that breakthroughs are as much about discipline and restraint as innovation, that technology amplifies preparation rather than replacing it. In academic and ethical debates, the use of genealogical databases remained contentious, and the Florida case was frequently referenced as an example of success achieved with careful oversight. Scholars dissected the decision-making process that led investigators to pursue familial matching, examining the safeguards that prevented misuse and the transparency that allowed public trust to be maintained. These discussions extended the life of the case beyond its legal conclusion, embedding it within broader conversations about privacy, consent, and the evolving boundaries of investigation. The community itself absorbed the case into its collective identity in subtle ways, not as a defining trauma, but as a lesson quietly passed down. Parents spoke to children about awareness without fear, about the importance of noticing changes in routine, of trusting instincts while maintaining openness. These conversations lacked the urgency of earlier warnings, reflecting a confidence rooted in the knowledge that accountability, though delayed, had proven possible. The crime no longer loomed as an unresolved threat, but as a chapter that had been fully read. Anniversaries passed with decreasing attention, each one reinforcing the sense that the case had settled into memory rather than continuing to demand reaction. The date remained significant to those closest to it, but for the wider community, it became a reference point rather than a trigger. This gradual shift signaled a healthy distancing, an acknowledgement that remembrance does not require constant re-exposure to pain. The balance between honoring the past and inhabiting the present had finally been struck. Within correctional facilities, the killer's life narrowed into routine, his story stripped of narrative power as days blended together, and the notoriety that once surrounded his name dissipated. Reports described a man aging quietly, his relevance confined to legal records and occasional academic citations, a stark contrast to the outsized impact of his actions. This diminishment felt appropriate, an inversion of the attention he had commanded during the investigation and trial, reinforcing the idea that violence does not entitle its perpetrators to lasting prominence. For those who study crime, the Florida cold case remained instructive precisely because it resisted simplification. It demonstrated how easily early assumptions can harden into blind spots, how institutional memory can both preserve and obscure, and how progress often depends on revisiting what was once set aside. The case underscored the importance of humility in investigation, a willingness to accept that answers may arrive long after confidence has faded. As time extended beyond the 20th anniversary of the crime, the narrative achieved a rare stability, no longer shifting with each new development. The story had been told, tested, and affirmed, its contours fixed by evidence rather than speculation. This stability allowed those connected to it to step back, to view it as a complete arc rather than an open wound, and in doing so, to integrate it into their understanding of justice and loss without being consumed by either. The Florida cold case, solved after 20 years, ultimately became a measure of endurance, a demonstration of what happens when silence is met not with resignation but with persistence. Its legacy was not defined by the moment of arrest or the final verdict, but by the years in between, the careful preservation of truth, and the refusal to accept that time alone should decide what is forgotten. In that refusal lay its quiet power, a reminder that even as decades pass and attention shifts elsewhere, the past remains present, waiting for the moment when it can finally be understood and allowed to rest. Long after the case settled into record rather than news, its presence could still be felt in the way people spoke about time and justice, as if the Florida cold case had recalibrated expectations, teaching patience in a culture accustomed to immediacy. It became a reference not because it was dramatic, but because it was methodical, a reminder that some truths require endurance rather than urgency, and that the absence of answers does not equal their impossibility. For those who had lived through the early years of uncertainty, memory remained layered, the sharpness of 2003 softened by distance, yet never fully erased. They recalled the fear that had briefly gripped the neighborhood, the uneasy glances exchanged with strangers, the way routines had been altered without discussion, and now those memories carried a different weight, framed by knowledge rather than speculation. What once felt chaotic now appeared structured, each fragment settling into a timeline that finally made sense. The victim's family continued to shape their lives around meaning rather than absence, honoring her through actions that reflected who she had been rather than how she died. Scholarships, volunteer work, and private rituals replaced public appeals and press conferences, a shift that marked the true end of their long vigil. They spoke less often about the investigation, not out of avoidance, but because the need to explain or defend their hope had finally passed. The story no longer belonged to the process, it belonged to memory. In law enforcement, the case influenced how success was defined, expanding it beyond clearance rates and convictions to include preservation and review. Agencies measured progress not only by solved cases, but by the condition of their archives, by how well they maintained the possibility of future answers. The Florida investigation served as a quiet benchmark, a standard invoked when evaluating whether an unsolved case had truly been abandoned or merely paused. Technological advances continued to reshape the landscape of forensic science, but the case stood as a reminder that innovation is only as effective as the systems prepared to support it. New tools emerged, promising faster identification and broader reach, yet the Florida cold case remained relevant because it demonstrated that the foundation of justice lies in discipline, in the unglamorous work of cataloging, storing, and revisiting. Without that groundwork, even the most advanced technology remains silent. Public conversations about cold cases grew more measured, tempered by the understanding that resolution is not guaranteed and that each investigation carries its own constraints. The Florida case was often cited to counter cynicism, to show that patience can yield results, but it was equally used to caution against false hope, emphasizing that perseverance must be matched by realism. This balanced narrative marked a maturation in how society engaged with unresolved crime. The community itself evolved in response to the lessons absorbed over 2 decades, adopting a quieter vigilance that did not rely on fear. Neighborhood groups focused on communication rather than suspicion, on awareness without paranoia, a shift influenced by the recognition that the original danger had gone unnoticed precisely because it looked ordinary. This understanding fostered a more nuanced approach to safety, one grounded in connection rather than isolation. The physical artifacts of the case continued to age, evidence preserved in controlled environments, documents digitized, recordings converted to new formats to prevent loss. Each act of maintenance represented a commitment to memory, an acknowledgement that justice depends not only on action but on care. The Florida case exemplified this principle, its resolution the product of decades of quiet stewardship rather than a single dramatic breakthrough. In the realm of public policy, the case remained a touchstone, referenced when advocating for funding that prioritized long-term investigative capacity over short-term metrics. Legislators and administrators pointed to it as evidence that investment in preservation yields dividends measured in accountability rather than speed. These arguments extended the case's influence far beyond its original jurisdiction, shaping decisions that would affect investigations yet to begin. As the story receded further into the past, it acquired a steadiness that allowed for reflection without urgency. Discussions shifted from what happened to what had been learned, from the specifics of the crime to the principles it illuminated. This transition marked the final stage of the case's public life, transforming it from an active narrative into a source of understanding. Ultimately, the Florida cold case endured not because of the crime itself, but because of the way it challenged assumptions about time, memory, and justice. It showed that resolution can arrive long after attention has waned, that silence does not signify surrender, and that the past retains its claim on the present until it is acknowledged. In that acknowledgement, the case found its conclusion, not as an ending imposed by the calendar, but as a truth finally allowed to stand, complete and unambiguous, in the light of understanding. That night, The cold case, long believed to be asleep, was dragged back into the light. A minor detail, just a single overlooked note, began to unravel years of certainty. It wasn't that the killer was smarter than the police. The truth had simply been buried too deep beneath time, routine, and very human mistakes. An old tape was digitized. Static, uneven breathing, then a sentence cut short. Years ago, it had been labeled no evidentiary value. This time, with modern tools, every breath sharpened into focus. A name was whispered, one that did not match any official suspect. Investigators returned to the scene. The alley, once thought fully documented, revealed a secondary exit concealed by a temporary structure erected after the crime. Back then, no one recorded it. Now, it became the missing piece. The escape route was redrawn, shorter, cleaner, and leading straight into an aging residential block. Financial records opened another layer of truth. A large cash deposit, unexplained, appeared the week after the murder. The account holder was a man once praised as a key witness. His testimony had steered the investigation in a decisive direction. Today, it raised the loudest question of all. The interrogation unfolded in heavy silence. No harsh lights, no pressure, just precise questions placed exactly where they belonged. The man lowered his head, his hands trembling slightly. When the name from the tape was spoken, he closed his eyes, for only a second, but it was enough. Everyone in the room knew they had struck the nerve. The truth did not explode like it does in movies. It leaked out slowly, painfully. A quiet agreement, a fear of exposure, one wrong decision that stretched into decades. And at the center of it all, a cold case that was no longer cold, just waiting for the moment someone finally listened closely enough. The arrest did not bring noise. No cheers. No relief that could be measured. When the suspect was finally named, when the cold case was stamped with the word solved, the town did not erupt. It went quiet. A different kind of quiet. The kind that settles after a storm has already passed, when the damage has been standing there for years and no one knows how to undo it. The house where he was taken from looked ordinary. White paint. Trimmed hedges. A porch light still on in the early morning. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, their faces frozen in disbelief. This was the man who waved at them. The man who lent tools. The man who testified confidently in 2003. The man who helped bury the truth in plain sight. Inside the interrogation room, the confession came without drama. No shouting. No breakdown. Just a voice worn down by time, finally choosing to stop running. He spoke of panic, of a confrontation that escalated too fast, of one irreversible moment followed by years of pretending it never happened. He spoke as if the years had been a sentence of their own, as if living free had somehow punished him enough. But outside that room, the damage told a different story. The victim's family heard the news through a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes. 20 years of waiting compressed into a few sentences. Identified. Arrested. Case closed. There was no word in the language that could describe what came next. Relief tangled with rage. Answers arriving far too late to heal anything they touched. Reporters returned to the street where it all began. Cameras pointed at cracked pavement, at the narrow space that once held a body and now held nothing but shadow. Headlines flashed again. Florida 2003 cold case solved. Killer identified after 20 years. Clean words. Sharp letters. No mention of birthdays missed. Of parents who died without answers. Of a community that learned too late how easily the truth can be redirected. Investigators reviewed the file one final time. The missed detail. The trusted witness. The evidence logged but never questioned. No single failure had broken the case. It was a chain. And for 2 decades, that chain held. In private moments, some detectives admitted the truth they would never say on record. This case was solved not because the system worked, but because time cracked it open by accident. A better microphone. A sharper algorithm. A detail no human eye had noticed back then. Justice, delayed and imperfect, arriving only because technology finally caught up with a lie. The suspect now sits alone, his name stripped of anonymity, his past rewritten in a single paragraph beneath his mugshot. But even that feels unfinished, because knowing who did it does not explain why no one stopped him sooner. It does not restore what was taken. It does not erase the years where fear, rumors, and unanswered questions haunted this place. At night, the alley is quiet again. No tape, no lights, just darkness stretching where the truth once hid. People still walk faster when they pass it, still lower their voices, still feel that familiar chill, because some mysteries leave a residue, even after they are solved. This cold case is closed on paper, but in memory, it remains open, a reminder that silence can last for decades, and that sometimes the most terrifying part of the story isn't the crime itself. It's how long the world is willing to look the other way. Weeks pass, and the headlines begin to thin out. The cameras leave first, then the vans, then the strangers who came only to witness closure. What remains is heavier, quieter, harder to define. The cold case may be solved, but its gravity does not lift. It settles deeper into the town, into the walls of homes that watched the story unfold in fragments for 20 years. The courtroom is smaller than anyone imagined. No cinematic grandeur, just wood, fluorescent light, and the slow rhythm of procedure. The suspect sits motionless, older than the man described in the files, thinner than the figure remembered by witnesses. When the charges are read, there is no reaction. Not from him, not from the room. Only the sound of paper shifting, the soft scrape of a chair, the echo of a past that refuses to stay buried. The victim's name is spoken aloud again. For the first time in years, it is not followed by the word missing or unknown. It is followed by facts, dates, a cause, a sequence. Each word lands like a weight. The family listens, hands clenched, absorbing information they once begged for, now arriving when it can no longer change anything. Closure is promised in theory. In reality, it feels more like a door closing behind them, locking away the version of hope they carried for 2 decades. Outside, life resumes its rhythm. Children ride bikes past the alley. New residents move into renovated homes, unaware of what happened there, or aware but choosing distance over curiosity. Time does what it always does. It moves forward without asking permission. And yet, for those who remember, every ordinary moment carries an undertone. Every siren sounds louder. Every silence feels intentional. Investigators give their final statements. They speak carefully about perseverance, about advances in technology, about justice, even delayed, still being justice. But when the microphones turn off, some of them stay behind, staring at the old evidence boxes one last time. They know this case will follow them, not as a victory, but as a lesson written in margins and footnotes, a reminder of how easily certainty can be manufactured, how fragile truth really is. The cold case enters archives and podcasts, documentaries and late-night discussions. It becomes a story people consume, analyze, debate. Strangers argue online about guilt, about motive, about whether the system redeemed itself in the end. They never mention the long nights before the answer, the years where nothing moved, the weight of not knowing. And in the quietest hours, when the town sleeps, there are still moments when the past feels present. A porch light flicks on for no reason. A shadow lingers where it shouldn't. Not because the killer is free, but because the memory of what happened refuses to fade on command. Solved does not mean healed. Identified does not mean understood. And justice, when it arrives this late, does not arrive whole. This was a cold case. Now it is a scar. Invisible to some, unavoidable to others. And long after the files are closed, long after the last headline is forgotten, the story remains, not as a mystery but as a warning, echoing softly through the silence left behind. Years from now, people will struggle to remember the exact details. The date, the weather, the order of events. Memory softens edges the way water wears down stone. But there are parts of this cold case that time will never fully erase, no matter how much the world moves on. The victim's photograph still circulates quietly. Not on front pages anymore, but in family albums, in archived police files, in the minds of those who knew that smile before it became evidence. A face frozen at the age they never grew past. A life paused in a single frame while everything else kept going. The suspect's name fades faster than expected. Infamy is brief. He becomes another entry in a database, another inmate in a system designed to absorb men like him and move forward. What remains is not his story, but the space he occupied, the years he walked free while the truth waited, patient and ignored. The town learns to live with its reflection. People talk differently now, with hesitation, with awareness that certainty is fragile, that trust can be misplaced, that evil does not always announce itself. Some residents leave. Others stay, anchored by roots too deep to pull free. New generations grow up hearing fragments, never the full weight of what happened, only the echo. Investigators retire. Evidence rooms are reorganized. Files are boxed, relabeled, archived under a word that once felt impossible, solved. But among those who worked the case, there is no clean ending. Only the quiet understanding that answers arrived because something finally broke, not because everything was done right. At night, the alley still exists. Asphalt replaced. Lighting improved. Officially safe. Unofficially untouched. People pass through it every day without stopping, unaware that the ground beneath them once held a question so heavy it bent the lives around it. Places remember, even when people try not to. This cold case no longer asks who did it. That question has an answer now. Instead, it asks something harder. How many years can a lie survive? How many voices can be ignored before silence becomes policy? How many truths are still waiting, buried not by malice, but by assumption? The story ends where it began. Not with closure. Not with peace. But with awareness. Because somewhere in another town, another file is gathering dust. Another name is waiting to be spoken correctly. Another truth is being delayed by time, routine, and human error. And when that case finally surfaces, years from now, decades from now, it will sound familiar. Another cold case. Another shock. Another reminder that the past never really disappears. It only waits. Long after the verdict, long after the courtroom emptied and the last legal document was signed, questions continued to circulate quietly, like air trapped in a sealed room. They did not belong to journalists anymore. They belonged to the people who had lived with the uncertainty, who had built routines around a mystery they never chose. Why that night? Why that place? Why did the warning signs feel invisible until it was too late? The cold case had an ending on paper, but in conversations it kept reopening. At kitchen tables. In late-night phone calls. In half-finished sentences that began with "if only." If only the timeline had been questioned sooner. If only the witness hadn't been trusted so easily. If only the system had paused long enough to doubt itself. The victim's family learned to speak a new language, one shaped by hindsight. They replayed memories, searching for meaning in ordinary moments that now felt prophetic. A canceled plan. A phone call unanswered. A route taken out of habit. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just the quiet decisions that separate a normal day from a tragedy that never lets go. Community leaders held meetings. They spoke about healing, about moving forward, about resilience. The words sounded right. They always do. But beneath them was an unspoken understanding. The sense of safety had changed permanently. Not shattered, reshaped. Trust became conditional. Certainty became rare. For law enforcement, the case became a reference point, a file mentioned in training rooms, stripped of emotion, and reduced to lessons learned. Verify witnesses. Re-examine assumptions. Document everything. But even there, among bullet points and protocols, the shadow of the case lingered. Because no checklist could fully explain how close the truth had been, and how easily it had been missed. The alley was eventually renamed in city records. A small administrative change. New signage. Fresh paint. But locals still use the old description. The place where it happened. No official effort could overwrite collective memory. Some spaces absorb history so deeply they carry it forever. This cold case did more than identify a killer. It exposed how fragile certainty is. How easily narratives harden into facts. How time can protect lies as effectively as it hides truths. And even now, when people say the case is over, their voices lower instinctively. Because deep down, they know endings like this are never complete. They echo. They ripple outward, touching other stories, other investigations, other unanswered files sitting quietly on shelves. The questions remain, not because the truth is unknown, but because knowing it came at such a cost. And somewhere between relief and regret, the town continues on, carrying the weight of answers that arrived far too late, wondering how many other truths are still waiting to be asked the right way. In the end, what lingers is not the crime, not even the confession. It is the echo, the quiet reverberation that follows after everything has supposedly been resolved. After the paperwork, after the sentencing, after the phrase "case closed" is spoken one final time and filed away. The town breathes differently now. Not easier, just differently. There is an awareness woven into everyday life, subtle but permanent. People lock doors without thinking. Parents ask more questions. Witnesses hesitate before assuming what they saw was insignificant. The cold case has altered the rhythm of ordinary caution, turning it into something sharper, more deliberate. The victim's family learns how to exist with answers that came too late to change the past. They stop waiting for phone calls that will never come again. They stop imagining alternate endings. Grief settles into a quieter shape, not smaller, just more familiar. The truth did not free them, but it stopped the endless wondering. And sometimes, that is the only mercy left. The investigators move on to new files. New names. New mysteries. But this one never fully releases its grip. It surfaces in moments of doubt, in cases where the evidence feels too clean, the witness too confident. This cold case becomes a voice in the back of their minds, asking them to slow down, to look again, to distrust certainty when it arrives too quickly. Years later, someone unfamiliar with the story will stumble across it online. A headline, a documentary clip, a late-night podcast episode. They will listen, surprised that it took so long, shocked that the answer was there all along. Then they will move on. Another story consumed. Another mystery checked off. But for those who lived it, this was never content. It was time. It was absence. It was silence stretched across decades. The alley still exists. So does the house. So does the memory. The physical world carries on, indifferent, while meaning remains trapped in the minds of those who remember how uncertainty once felt. Places don't forget. People don't fully forget either. They adapt. They carry. This cold case is no longer a question. It is a reminder that truth does not always surface quickly, that justice does not always arrive intact, that the past waits patiently, not to be dramatic, but to be acknowledged. And somewhere right now, another unanswered file sits in the dark. Another name waits. Another silence grows. Because some stories don't end when they are solved. They end when the echo finally fades. And this one hasn't. There comes a point when time no longer protects anyone. When the years that once blurred faces and softened memories turn sharp, exposing what they were hiding all along. This cold case reached that point quietly, without warning, the way truth often does when it finally decides to surface. The suspect sits alone now, measured not by who he was, but by what he avoided becoming known for. His past is dissected by strangers who never met him, reduced to timelines and motives, to speculation and analysis. Yet none of it explains the most unsettling part, that he lived an ordinary life while the answer waited inches from discovery. Time did not change him. It concealed him. The town feels older because of it. Not in years, but in awareness. People understand now that history does not stay where it belongs. It leaks. It resurfaces. It demands attention long after everyone assumes it has gone quiet. This cold case taught them that forgetting is not the same as resolution, and silence is not the same as peace. In police departments far beyond Florida, the case is mentioned again. Not loudly, not publicly, but in quiet professional spaces where lessons are learned the hard way. Evidence is revisited. Witnesses are reconsidered. Files once thought settled are reopened, if only for a second look. The ripple travels farther than anyone expected. The victim's name is spoken less often now, but with more care. No longer framed by uncertainty, it carries the weight of finality. A story completed, but not corrected. A life acknowledged, but not restored. Time gave answers, but it never gave anything back. This cold case proves something unsettling. That justice is not guaranteed by effort alone. That truth can be delayed not by complexity, but by confidence placed in the wrong place. And that the past does not fade because we ask it to. It fades only when it is confronted fully. Night returns to the alley, as it always does. Lights flicker. Shadows stretch. Nothing dramatic happens. And yet, the space feels different now, no longer defined by mystery, but by memory. The question is gone. The weight remains. Because time, once used as a shield, eventually turns into a mirror. And when it does, it reflects everything that was missed. This cold case is no longer waiting. It has spoken. And what it said will not be forgotten. Knowing changes things. Not all at once. Not cleanly. It seeps in, settling into places that once relied on uncertainty to survive. This cold case, finally answered, left behind a truth heavier than the mystery it replaced. For years, not knowing had been a strange kind of shelter. It allowed hope to exist without shape. It allowed rumors to fill the gaps. It allowed people to believe that the answer, whatever it was, might somehow make sense. Now that knowing has arrived, it offers no such comfort. It simply exists, solid, immovable, impossible to argue with. The town learns this lesson slowly. At first, there is a need to revisit everything. Old conversations. Old assumptions. Who said what? Who was believed? Who wasn't? Memory becomes a crime scene of its own, searched for signs that were missed, instincts that were ignored. Everyone becomes an investigator in hindsight, tracing lines that only look obvious once they've been drawn. Some people feel anger, sharp and immediate, not just at the man who did it, but at the years that allowed him to blend in so completely. Others feel something quieter, a dull betrayal, the realization that safety had been an illusion built on familiarity. Evil didn't arrive from the outside. It stood close. It spoke clearly. It waited. Law enforcement faces a different reckoning. Not public. Internal. The kind that doesn't make headlines but alters careers. Meetings happen behind closed doors. Policies are reviewed. Language becomes more careful. This cold case becomes a reference, a cautionary tale whispered between professionals who understand how thin the line is between certainty and error. The victim's family carries the heaviest knowledge of all. They no longer wonder what happened. They no longer imagine alternate truths. The question has been answered, but the answer is permanent. There is no room left for possibility, no space where hope can still rearrange the outcome. Knowing is final, and finality has its own kind of pain. They visit the place less often now, not because it no longer matters, but because it matters differently. The past has stopped shifting. It has chosen a shape, and that shape cannot be softened by time. Grief, once fueled by questions, now survives on memory alone. This cold case also leaves behind a quiet responsibility, a demand that no one says, "It couldn't happen here." A reminder that systems are human and humans miss things. That trust must be earned continuously, not granted once and left unquestioned. That truth is not loud by default. It waits to be noticed. The world moves on, as it always does. New stories replace old ones. New mysteries demand attention. But somewhere beneath the noise, this case remains a fixed point, a reminder etched into record books and recollections alike. Because once you know, you can't return to before. You can't unknow what was hidden. You can't pretend silence meant safety. This cold case did more than reveal a killer. It revealed how fragile certainty really is. And that knowledge, quiet, heavy, unavoidable, will outlast every headline that ever tried to contain it. There is a belief people hold on to that once the truth is known, something resets, that the world clicks back into alignment. This cold case proves how false that belief is. Because even after the answer arrives, some things remain permanently out of place. Time does not rewind. It does not return missed chances or restore trust where it quietly eroded. It simply keeps moving, carrying the consequences forward. The town feels this in small ways. In conversations that end sooner than they used to. In glances held a second too long. In the unspoken agreement that certainty is something to be handled carefully now. The case file sits complete on a shelf, its spine marked clearly, decisively. Solved. But behind that word are years that cannot be compressed into paperwork. Birthdays that passed without answers. Parents who aged while waiting. Friends who stopped asking questions because asking hurt too much. None of that fits inside a folder. The suspect's presence fades from daily thought. His face becomes less familiar. His name less spoken. Accountability is established, but meaning remains elusive. Knowing who committed the act does not explain how so many moments aligned to protect him. It does not explain how silence became routine. It only confirms that it did. The victim's story changes shape again. No longer a mystery, no longer a headline. It becomes something quieter, personal, carried privately by those who remember details no investigation ever recorded. The sound of a laugh, a habit, a future that once felt obvious and now feels impossible to imagine without loss. Professionally, the cold case is dissected. Conferences mention it. Articles analyze it. Experts debate where it went wrong and where it finally went right. Each discussion is framed as progress, as learning. And maybe it is. But learning does not undo. It only prepares for what comes next. And what comes next is always another case. Another file. Another uncertainty waiting to test the system. This one becomes a shadow in the background, influencing decisions in ways that will never be publicly acknowledged. A pause before trusting. A second look before closing a door. At night, the town settles the way it always has. Streetlights hum. Houses glow softly. On the surface, nothing distinguishes this place from any other. But beneath it all is a quiet understanding that resolution is not the same as repair. This cold case was solved, but it was not fixed. Some damage does not announce itself. It becomes part of the structure. A load-bearing absence. And long after the truth is known, the weight of what can never be restored continues to shape everything built on top of it.